Hello and welcome to the Good Food Institute's webinar on cultivated meat, seafood, and ingredients. My name is Daniel Gertner, and I'm the lead economic and industry analyst here at GFI. Today, my colleagues and I will cover the evolving cultivated meat and seafood industry. We'll discuss the commercial landscape, investments, consumer insights, scientific progress, regulatory and public investment updates, and industry outlook. For those of you not yet familiar with the Good Food Institute, we are a nonprofit think tank working to build a sustainable, secure, and just food system by advancing alternative proteins. We work across the areas of corporate engagement, science and technology, and policy. We are funded entirely by philanthropy, so if you find the insights and resources we provide useful, please consider donating. At GFI, we focus on feeding a growing population sustainably, efficiently, and safely. Demand for meat contributes to pressing global challenges like climate change, antibiotic resistance, pandemic risk, loss of biodiversity, and hunger and malnutrition. Alternative proteins offer a globally scalable solution that can address these challenges while helping satisfy the growing global demand for meat. We map out the most neglected areas that will allow alternative proteins to compete on taste, price, and nutrition. We meet these challenges by funding open access research, developing resources, and educating and connecting the next generation of scientists and entrepreneurs working on food system sustainability. This webinar is an overview of GFI's annual Cultivated Meat, Seafood, and Ingredients State of the Industry Report. We also published State of the Industry reports for the plant-based and fermentation sectors, along with a report on the state of global policy. Webinars are available for each of those reports. This year, we also released a State of Alternative Proteins report, which shares stories about the people and places advancing plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation-enabled proteins. All these reports can be downloaded for free by going to this link. I'd like to thank the many GFI team members who contributed to this project, as well as external partners who supported with data and fact-checking. If you'd like to help us make our reports, webinars, and other open access resources as accurate as possible, please tell us about your company by joining GFI's company database, which is accessible on our website, and respond to surveys when we send them out. Signing up for our monthly industry newsletter is the best way to stay updated on our research, which you can also do through our website. Today's presentation is focused on cultivated meat, which is meat grown directly from animal cells. The process of cultivating meat uses the basic elements needed to build muscle and fat and enables the same biological process that happens inside an animal. Around the world, protein innovation is progressing amid both successes and struggles. Cultivated meat is a rapidly advancing sector with products currently approved for sale in multiple jurisdictions around the world, but the field is also navigating complex headwinds. In 2024, the field made scientific progress in cost reduction, bioreactor advancements, and cell line innovations. Governments around the world ramped up support. From Singapore to the EU to India, public investment is positioning protein diversification, including cultivated meat, as a tool for food security and resilience. At the same time, the topic of consumer choice is increasingly coming to the forefront. As some countries embrace cultivated meat, others move to restrict it, fueling a global conversation about innovation and access. This is a critical moment. The sector is young, the opportunity is large, and the groundwork for the future of the global protein supply is being laid right now. With that, let's dive into the commercial landscape for cultivated meat, seafood, and ingredients. The cultivated meat sector was shaped by both progress and roadblocks in 2024. Several companies made strides in product development, scale-up, and cross-sector partnerships, while others paused expansion plans or closed operations. Despite challenges, companies advanced technologies, reduced costs, and launched new products across several jurisdictions. We'll cover some of the year's key developments in this section. In 2024, GFI's company database identified 155 companies focused primarily on cultivated meat and seafood, and an additional 126 companies involved in the sector through investments, partnerships, or business lines. This represents an increase in the total number of companies involved in the sector relative to previous years. Plus, the industry increasingly includes companies with focus areas across the entire cultivated meat value chain, from target molecule selection to end product formulation and manufacturing. This specialization enables companies to focus on their core strengths and will be key to improving efficiency and scaling the industry. In 2024, we also saw strides in building out cultivated meat and seafood infrastructure. At least 4 new production facilities were announced or opened across the globe, each representing a different stage of the value chain. Maltus launched a commercial-scale facility in the UK focused on serum-free growth media. Nutreco opened a food-grade cell feed plant in the Netherlands. Blue Seafood began operating a pilot plant in Germany. And Cell Agritech and Umami Bioworks announced plans for a joint facility in Malaysia focused on cultivated meat and seafood. We also saw the emergence of innovation hubs, which are shared spaces designed to help companies de-risk their scale-up strategies and test commercial viability without bearing the full capital burden of a standalone facility. 2 notable examples in 2024 include the Cultured Hub in Switzerland and a new scale-up facility in Sweden from Remeat and Alfa Laval. These hubs can help reduce production costs and shorten the time to market for early-stage companies. That said, not every story in 2024 represented advancements. Some companies hit pause on their expansion plans or had to scale back due to a lack of funding. In many cases, the missing ingredient wasn't technical capability, it was regulatory clarity and access to funding. Companies need funding to validate, refine, and scale their production processes. However, investors may be reluctant to provide capital if regulatory timelines remain unclear or if companies have yet to demonstrate commercial-scale production capabilities. This dynamic may encourage companies to explore other scale-up paths. Instead of building new infrastructure from scratch, some companies are exploring partnerships with players that already have the right equipment or resources to support commercial-scale production. So while the facility landscape evolved in 2024, unlocking the next wave of capacity will depend on both regulatory progress and creative approaches to financing and scale-up. Many of the world's largest meat and consumer packaged good companies remain active in the cultivated meat industry through investments, acquisitions, partnerships, and/or research, development, and manufacturing. In 2024, for example, Aleph Farms submitted Thailand's first cultivated meat application after preparing for nearly a year in close collaboration with company investor Thai Union. These types of partnerships underscore cultivated meat's potential as a strategic pathway for incumbents to diversify protein portfolios and future-proof their supply chains. 2024 was a year of meaningful commercial momentum for cultivated meat in terms of both partnerships and new products hitting the market. On the partnership side, we saw a focus on 3 key areas: cost reduction, scaling, and product development. Several companies leveraged AI to optimize production processes and lower input costs, while others partnered to advance scaling capabilities. Plus, multiple product development partnerships were formed to advance cultivated meat and ingredients. We also saw product launches bring cultivated meat to more consumers. Good Meat 3, a product containing 3% cultivated chicken, debuted as the world's first retail product with cultivated meat, available in the frozen section of Huber's Butchery in Singapore. Vow launched cultivated quail parfait and foie gras in Singapore and briefly in Hong Kong, giving one of the world's most populous regions its first taste of cultivated meat. While still limited in scale, these launches represent regulatory and commercial traction and serve as early proof points that cultivated meat continues to move toward wider commercial availability. Moving to investments. Since the first disclosed investment in cultivated meat and seafood in 2013, companies in the sector have raised over $3 billion. In 2024, companies brought in $139 million, according to GFI's analysis of data from Net Zero Insights. The funding landscape for cultivated meat has shifted to a more subdued environment in recent years. Elevated interest rates, uncertain scale-up timelines, and regulatory hurdles have slowed the flow of capital into the sector. Fewer companies are now raising money, and the rounds they do raise are generally smaller than they were during the low interest rate period of 2020 to 2022. The slowdown mirrors a broader decline in climate tech investments, which have also dipped each year since 2021. While total venture funding saw slight growth in 2024, That growth was almost entirely driven by investments in AI, meaning growth in AI funding was likely at the expense of other sectors. Plus, the scope of cultivated meat investment remains small relative to many other industries. The electric vehicle sector, for example, raised $3.3 billion globally in the first 3 quarters of 2024 alone, which is more than the entire cultivated meat sector has raised all time. In 2024, cultivated meat companies still advanced regulatory approvals, improved production processes, and expanded product offerings despite limited access to funding. But to continue this momentum, they need more resources and more diverse funding strategies. To scale, the sector will need to look beyond traditional venture capital and build out a more multi-pronged approach to funding, which I'll touch on in a later slide. While 2024 was marked by a tighter capital market, bright spots still emerged. While 2024 was marked by a tighter capital market, bright spots still emerged. The two largest deals included a $54.6 million Series B round from Prolific Machines and a roughly $43 million raise from Mosumate. These two deals were both larger than 2023's largest round, but neither ranked among the top 10 largest investments in the sector all time. So this tells us a few things. First, investment appetite still exists for strong, differentiated players. Second, the broader funding landscape has reset and will likely stay lower for the near term until companies can prove scale, cost efficiency, and market traction. And finally, the cultivated meat sector is still in its early stages, and limited commercial sales mean most companies remain pre-revenue. In today's tighter capital environment, that means some manufacturers will be unable to secure funding and will downsize, close operations, or merge with other organizations. But consolidation shouldn't be equated with decline. Consolidation is inevitable for any nascent sector, and it can actually accelerate progress by concentrating talent, IP, and know-how. So we'll continue to watch how these trends develop over the next year or so. So let's talk about where we go from here. As I just mentioned, cultivated meat companies are largely pre-revenue and need capital-intensive infrastructure to scale. That's a mismatch for traditional venture capital, which typically isn't well suited to fund manufacturing facilities. That means that for companies today, the challenge is to diversify funding sources as they scale. That's where alternative financing mechanisms become essential. These include, but aren't limited to, equipment leasing and project finance, strategic corporate partnerships, and public sector programs and government investment. However, many of these channels remain underdeveloped for cultivated meat and other alternative proteins. As a result, it's more important than ever that companies, investors, governments, and philanthropists develop innovative funding solutions that support the growth of the cultivated meat industry. GFI also continues to conduct research, policy advocacy, investor engagement, and coalition building to create the infrastructure and incentives needed to unlock these new capital pathways and support the sector's long-term growth. Next, I'll hand it over to Taylor, our consumer research lead.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm Taylor, GFI's US Consumer Research Lead. The cultivated meat industry moved forward in 2024 in terms of regulatory approvals, investment progress, and even a product launch. But consumer awareness, interest, and perceptions remain mostly stable from 2023. This suggests the industry will need to build consumer awareness and interest to drive demand for products in the future. We did, though, get new research that expanded our understanding of consumer interest and perceptions globally, and a landmark study from Singapore that suggested that cultivated meat can deliver on consumers' sensory expectations. First, because there are different terms used for cultivated meat in the media, we at GFI measure how many US consumers have heard of cultivated meat by several names, including ones like lab grown that are in common use in media, though are not accurate in terms of how cultivated meat will be produced at commercial scales. Unfortunately, few Americans have heard of any of these names for cultivated meat, suggesting that few people have heard of the concept overall. And consumers who have heard of it are most likely to have heard of it by terms that could be considered pejorative and inaccurate, like lab grown. So overall, this suggests that the industry will need to do some work to build awareness of terms that are more accurate and tend to be received more favorably by consumers, like cultivated meat. The full report also summarizes recent research that GFI has done exploring the trade-offs between these different terms. In the context of a new technology that most people haven't heard of, we choose to explain the concept to consumers before asking questions like whether they're willing to try or buy it. And results from GFI's 2024 polling suggest that a significant minority of US consumers would be interested in cultivated meat after hearing a short, neutral description of it shown on the right half of the screen here, but not a majority. We found that 32% of American adults find the concept of cultivated meat appealing, 28% say they'd be likely to try a free sample if offered today, and 17% would be likely to purchase it based on what they know. These results are not surprising given the low rates of awareness of cultivated meat and comparable to rates that we saw in our 2023 polling. The full report also goes into more detail on how people perceive cultivated meat. But in general, we found that US consumers are likely to believe that cultivated meat is more sustainable than conventional meat, but also likely to see it as less healthy, tasty, and natural. But given these rates of openness and exposure to critical names like lab grown meat, that might not be surprising. So let's also dig into people's hesitations at potentially trying cultivated meat. A total of 25% of US consumers who were unlikely to try cultivated meat cited expecting not to like the taste or texture as one of their top reasons, and 16% cited health. These are often things that we discuss as key decision-making factors for alt proteins specifically, but also for food in general, not just for cultivated meat. But even more consumers cited just preferring conventional meat, 37%, or not thinking that cultivated meat is natural, 36%. And this has become increasingly important to many consumers who are seeking clean label, organic foods, etc. But overall, there's no single reason that was selected by a majority of Americans, suggesting that there's no majority objection that the industry can work to address at the moment as cultivated meat comes to market. GFI Europe also did research on cultivated meat in 2024 in a wide variety of European countries shown on the left here. They found that many consumers across EU countries would be willing to try cultivated meat. More than 50% of those in Belgium, Czechia, Denmark, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Spain, and Sweden would all be willing to try. And there were also significant pluralities of consumers in Austria, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, and Romania. And all of these rates, it should be said, appear to be higher than those that we saw in our US polling. They also went deeper on attitudes towards issues like food safety and regulation around cultivated meat, and we've linked the full report here at the bottom, which will provide more detail on that. Finally, we also saw a very big research milestone out of Singapore this year. How well cultivated meat can match the sensory properties of conventional meat is one of the key things the industry is exploring, one of the main things that we see consumers saying they're interested in, and one of the main reasons we expect people to adopt cultivated meat as it comes to market. And researchers in Singapore published the first peer-reviewed study in 2024 on cultivated meat, measuring consumers' perceptions in a real-world context where they were actually buying and eating cultivated meat. They surveyed more than 100 people who purchased and ate a cultivated chicken product produced by Good Meat at Huber's Butchery and Bistro in Singapore in 2023, and found that consumers rated it highly in terms of taste, willingness to eat it again, and how likely they'd be to recommend it to others. The full study goes much deeper on their motivations and needs for these products as well, and the paper is linked here and also summarized by GFI's Asia Pacific team in our full report. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Elliot Schwartz to discuss the state of science and technology.
Thank you, Taylor. I'm Elliot Schwartz, Principal Scientist for Cultivated Meat at GFI, and I'll be providing an overview of the science and technology landscape. One of the things that we've done for the past several years at GFI is track growth in scientific publications, as this provides a sense of the type of research activity that's happening in the sector. In 2024, over 150 primary researchers were published, keeping the trend of a steady rise year over year that really kicked off in 2020. Looking into the data, we observed that research into cultivated seafood really spiked in 2024, led by labs across Asia. And this is important because to this date, cultivated seafood has really lagged behind research in terrestrial meat. We also observed that some of the first research into cultivated dairy, which is cultivating real animal milk from mammary cells, was published in 2024, signaling the emergence of a new subspecialty under the cultivated umbrella. Another way to track research and really broader innovation across the ecosystem is through patent landscape analysis. And 2024 was really the first time that we've done this. In the past decade, patent activity surged to over 1,000 unique filings across 450 different patent families. Shown in the image are the individual companies and academic institutions that are the top holders of patents across cultivated meat. We observed that nearly half of these top 15 patent holders were companies or academic institutions based in China. And we also observed that beyond the top 15, a growing number of companies and academic institutions in South Korea and Japan have increasingly shown interest in cultivated meat. One of the other areas that we've been tracking is the availability of cell lines. And in 2024, there were numerous papers that described the creation and characterization of new cell lines across various species, some of which are shown here, most notably various different types of fish and aquatic species. In our own database, which tracks cell lines that have been created and are now available to researchers around the world, our database grew to over 75 different cell lines being listed. And as of recording, it's currently at over 90. So this is a good indication that there's continued interest in the development of cell lines, as well as increasing accessibility of cell lines, which are really crucial foundational research tools for the community. Another area of research is the cell culture media. And we know from prior work that cell culture media is really the major cost driver of cultivated meat production. In 2024, researchers at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem published the lowest ever media formulation at around 63 cents per liter. One of the key innovations in this paper was the replacement of serum albumin with lower cost, common food grade ingredients. Previously, albumin made up around 33% of serum-free media costs, but being able to replace it with these lower cost food grade ingredients reduced costs from $3.26 per liter all the way down to 63 cents per liter. The study also looked at, while taking this media formulation and based on data collected at pilot scale, that a 50-50 plant-based cultivated chicken hybrid product could cost between around $6 and $10 per pound when hypothetically produced at scale. Now, one of the key trends that's really enabling cost reduction throughout the sector is this transition and increasingly accessibility to food-grade media inputs. Several companies have launched food-grade media products in 2024 that increases their accessibility not only to companies in the industry, but also to academic researchers. Lastly, a key area of research within cultivated meat media is research into hydrolysates for cell nutrition. In 2024, there were multiple studies that explored the performance of hydrolysates from raw materials such as animal feed pellets, yeast, algae, bacteria, and other agricultural side streams. Essentially, by breaking down these raw materials into the media input components such as amino acids, sugars, vitamins, and minerals, this could theoretically offer a more cost-effective and environmentally sustainable way to cultivate meat. Also, GFI in 2024 prioritized this area of research and awarded 7 different research grants for projects to further optimization of hydrolysates for cultivated meat. Lastly, it's also important to really increase cultivated meat's global accessibility, and that really begins with advances in manufacturing and scale up. In 2024, most notably, Val began operating commercially at 15,000 liter scale, with a 20,000 liter cultivator becoming operational in early 2025, shown in the image on the right. This is now the largest scale of operation in the sector that enables tons of cultivated meat to be produced on a monthly basis. Another trend is the opening and establishment of co-manufacturing facilities across the sector, such as the Cultured Hub in Switzerland. Several co-manufacturing facilities were also under construction in 2024 or received funding to build new future facilities, which will really serve as crucial pieces of infrastructure for new startups to move into, to begin to optimize their pilot scale operations, and also collect data that can be used for regulatory submissions. Lastly, fostering inclusion was another trend that we observed in 2024. So for instance, Singapore's Islamic Council announced that cultivated meat may be deemed as halal under certain conditions, with similar efforts now underway in several neighboring countries. This is crucially important as when cultivated meat does come to market, it can now be available to the nearly 2 billion people that follow halal dietary practices around the world. Finally, in Europe, there were several studies that investigated how cultivated meat fits into existing agricultural supply chains. Importantly, these studies incorporated input from farmers in interviews or workshop sessions to understand how they viewed cultivated meat as either a threat or opportunity, as well as educate them on this new method of meat production. With that, I'll hand it off to Michael, our policy specialist.
Thanks, Elliot. I'm Michael Carter, Policy Specialist in Diplomacy here at GFI. Overall, 2024 saw a jump in public investment in cultivated meat, with annual announced investments doubling from about 42 million in 2023 to about 84 million in 2024. This increase in public sector support was driven by even growth in opportunities across the Asia-Pacific region, while public investment in the Americas and Europe remained low. As in prior years, governments almost exclusively supported research and development efforts for cultivated meat, fat, and seafood, with relatively little support for the commercialization of these products or facility construction. Diving into some specifics from 2024, we see that cultivated meat received the bulk of its public investments from governments in the Asia-Pacific region, namely China, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and New Zealand, with supportive government action or statements from Malaysia and Thailand as well. These governments increased their investments in cultivated meat for a variety of reasons, chief among them the potential for bolstered food security through diversified and domestic food production. We saw governments take important steps towards food secure futures by investing in research and development on cultivated seafood, ensuring against ecosystem strain and overfishing, as well as reevaluating their regulatory processes to allow for entrepreneurship and innovation. Asia Pacific was not the exclusive home of cultivated meat progress, however. In 2024, the United Kingdom and Israel also continued to invest in cultivated meat R&D, making progress towards developing their countries into regional hubs for alt protein innovation. Importantly, 2024 also saw the further proliferation of national bioeconomy plans, which promise to power future efforts to research and commercialize cultivated food products and other biotechnologies. In 2024, both India and China announced billion-dollar plans to develop their national bioeconomies, with alternative proteins mentioned as key technologies in both plans. While the amount of support for cultivated meat and other alternative proteins in these plans is yet to be seen, both governments' commitments to biotechnology leadership bodes well for cultivated meat progress in Asia. Overall, the increase in support for cultivated meat in 2024 is significant, but the field lags behind the other alternative protein pillars when it comes to public investment, especially for important commercialization and infrastructure work. This creates an opportunity for governments, perhaps those that have instituted future-looking national biotechnology plans, to establish leadership in the field through investments in facilities, marketing, and product development. As Asian governments begin to lead the world in public support for cultivated meat and seafood, we may see heightened commercial activity and entrepreneurship cluster around regions designated as biotechnology hubs. And with cultivated meat increasingly seen as an essential pillar of biotechnology leadership, we can expect that international competition for leadership in this area will lead to increased investments in developing the field. I'll now pass it to Mackenzie, our regulatory attorney.
Thanks, Michael. In 2024, several countries advanced regulatory pathways for cultivated meat, with some of the most exciting regulatory milestones for cultivated meat coming out of the Middle East and Asia. At the same time, other governments attempted to ban the sale and consumption of cultivated meat products altogether. Today, I will briefly discuss some of these highs and lows. The year began with some landmark milestones. In January, Israel became the first country to approve a cultivated beef product following the cultivated chicken approvals from prior years in Singapore and the United States. In February, Singapore's Islamic Council issued a groundbreaking declaration that cultivated meat can be considered halal under certain circumstances. And then, as Daniel mentioned, in November, cultivated quail was introduced to one of the world's largest economies when it was briefly served to the public in Hong Kong SAR. Several other countries also advanced the regulatory frameworks for cultivated meat in 2024. Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, or FSANZ, proposed a shift from their existing novel foods framework to a new standards-based approach for regulating cultivated meat. FSANZ stated that this approach would better support innovation and provide a clearer path to market. In Brazil, as of March 16, 2024, cultivated meat companies can now register their products with Anvisa, the Brazilian health regulatory agency. Anvisa has indicated that it will define the next steps for bringing products to market upon receiving its first application. In the European Union, 2 regulatory submissions have been filed since GFI's last State of the Industry reports for cultivated meat. French company Gourmet submitted an application for its cultivated foie gras in July 2024, followed by Mosa Meat's application for cultivated beef fat in January 2025. These applications are currently under review by the European Food Safety Authority, the European Commission, and EU member states. In addition to the halal designation for cultivated meat, Singapore passed a food safety and security bill in January 2024. This legislation formalized and improved procedures for novel food applications, including those for cultivated meat. The bill incorporated feedback from GFI APAC, our affiliate organization in the Asia-Pacific region. In South Korea, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety began accepting applications for the regulatory approval of cultivated meat in early 2024, creating a tangible path to market for cultivated meat products for the first time. The government published detailed guidance to assist companies, and the review process is expected to take up to 270 days. Additionally, the government designated a northern province as a regulatory-free special zone to support cultivated meat innovation by removing certain regulatory barriers in that area. In October 2024, the United Kingdom announced plans to establish a cultivated meat regulatory sandbox, which is an opportunity for a limited number of companies to work directly with regulators to explore product development and regulatory strategies. And finally, in the United States, cultivated meat companies continue to follow the joint regulatory framework managed by the Food and Drug Administration and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In March 2025, Mission Barnes received a no-questions letter from the Food and Drug Administration for its cultivated pork fat, signaling the completion of the agency's safety review. The product now awaits approval from USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service. While several countries made exciting advancements in how they regulate cultivated meat, challenges remain in some jurisdictions. Following Italy's prohibition of cultivated meat in 2023, Hungary introduced a proposed national ban in July 2024, targeting both the production and marketing of cultivated meat. This proposed legislation was submitted through the European Union's Technical Regulation Information System, or TRIS procedure, which is a mechanism that allows EU member states and the European Commission to review and provide feedback on proposed laws that may impact the free movement of goods within the single market. As part of the TRIS process, several EU member states expressed concerns about Hungary's proposed restrictions. The European Commission also weighed in and suggested that the ban could be unjustified and potentially harmful to the integrity of the EU single market. The Italian ban remains in effect for now, but if the EU approves a cultivated meat product in the future, the ban may be vulnerable to challenges because it did not undergo the TRIS procedure, and if the European Commission approves a cultivated meat product, that approval will apply across all of the EU member states. In the United States, the cultivated meat industry faced some challenges at the state level. In March 2024, the Florida government enacted a bill banning cultivated meat throughout the state, and Alabama soon followed suit and enacted its own ban bill in May. Both bans are now in effect, although the Florida ban is currently being challenged by Upside Foods and the Institute for Justice, and litigation is ongoing. Despite these developments, most U.S. states have acknowledged that such bans pose barriers to a competitive and open marketplace. Of the 12 states that introduced cultivated meat bans last year, only Florida and Alabama enacted legislation. And now I'll hand it back to Daniel to close us out.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Over the past decade, cultivated meat has gone from a scientific concept to a commercial reality. Products have been available for consumers to purchase in Singapore, the US, and Hong Kong. But the number of people who have ever purchased cultivated meat is still somewhere in the thousands versus billions who regularly eat conventional meat. All this means that the cultivated meat industry is still early in its development, but 2024 laid important groundwork. Governments stepped up with record levels of public investment. New R&D centers launched globally, and innovation hubs opened to help companies de-risk scale-up. We also saw the first cultivated meat product reach retail in Singapore. At the same time, private investment declined. Regulatory timelines remain uncertain in many countries, and most companies are still pre-revenue. But as in any early-stage, high-capex sector, much of the progress is happening behind the scenes. Process validation, cost reduction, and technical breakthroughs continue to advance, even if the resulting products aren't yet showing up on shelves. So what does that mean for the year ahead? Several cultivated meat products are already in regulatory pipelines across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. With more approvals expected soon, we'll likely see expanded consumer access and new data on safety, nutrition, and sensory performance. On the scientific and technical side, we anticipate additional progress on key cost levers like food-grade media, alternative ingredients, and more scalable bioreactor systems. This type of bioprocess innovation will be essential for lowering costs and unlocking commercial viability. But financing remains a constraint. Venture capital is unlikely to cover the industry's full scale-up needs. Companies will need to adopt creative, multi-pronged strategies, supplementing private capital with public and philanthropic support. As companies learn to navigate this new financing landscape, those unable to access funding will likely downsize, consolidate with other companies, or close. As with any sector charting new paths in uncertain environments, it will take time to identify the most viable financing approaches, so some industry consolidation is likely to occur this year. Despite potential consolidation, the additional regulatory approvals and increased scale for select companies mean more cultivated meat will likely be produced and sold this year than in any other year to date. Zooming out, the market opportunity for cultivated meat remains significant. Global meat demand is expected to rise by over 50% from 2012 levels by 2050, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Cultivated meat can be part of the solution to meet that growing global meat demand by producing meat with less land, lower emissions, and improved food security. But to get there, we need a major ramp up in investment, regulatory clarity, and infrastructure development. This is not an overnight solution. Cultivated meat matching the taste, price, and availability of conventional meat is not inevitable. But with continued investment, innovation, and collaboration, cultivated meat has the potential to provide consumers with the products they love while increasing food security, promoting biodiversity, and protecting public and planetary health. So thank you for tuning in to our presentation on cultivated meat, seafood, and ingredients. We're optimistic about the future of cultivated meat as an agricultural innovation that addresses the root causes of many of the challenges our food supply faces today. As we close, I want to highlight 3 reasons for optimism. First, scientific progress is moving at a rapid rate. Researchers are solving difficult problems, lowering media costs, optimizing bioreactors, and unlocking new cell lines across species. 2024 saw notable advances in continuous manufacturing, large-scale bioprocess design, and several other areas. Second, the Asia-Pacific region continues to lead. Whether it's Singapore's pioneering regulatory framework, South Korea's cultivated meat development zone, or major research investments across India, China, and Japan, APAC is setting the pace. The region is proving what's possible when public institutions lean in to invest in innovation. And third, cultivated meat input costs are plummeting. Peer-reviewed studies now show serum-free media as low as 63 cents per liter, a 99% drop from farmer-grade baselines. This cost transformation is happening faster than what seemed possible even a few years ago. The path ahead will require sustained innovation, investment, and policy alignment. But with the progress achieved so far, we have a strong foundation to build on, and a compelling case for cultivated meat as a solution to meeting growing global meat demand. As a reminder, there are 2 more webinars in this series focusing on the plant-based and fermentation sectors, and 1 more focused on global policy. We invite you to watch each of those webinars and dive into our report series. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.